Chapter 10, Parts 1 and 2. Chapter 10, Tonight We Dine in Hell. Part 1, Victory Bay, Kronus. I stared at Charon with empty eyes, my mind struggling with what he just told me. I've been expertly mind-fucked. In fact, I now had a reason to suspect everything I knew from before boarding the ship that brought me here. Was Delcatar Vale even my name? I shook my head. I didn't have time for an existential crisis. I had to get myself in hand and deal with the brand new disaster that just found its way to fuck my life. Magos, we're about to enter combat with arch-traitors to the Imperium. Casualties are going to be extreme. Your experience will save some of our people who otherwise will die. That is the only reason. Commissar Weber isn't arranging a firing squad as we speak. I am not? Charles sounded particularly disappointed, and I couldn't blame him under these circumstances. I mean, as you command, my lord. You aren't. However, if the Magos fucks up again, I'm going to give him to our Ogrin friends and see how long it will take them to pull him apart. I like how you're thinking, Lord Inquisitor. That's not fair. I was only trying to help. Charon whined, making me wonder how the hell he managed to get to his current rank without someone killing him. Do the words "need to know" mean anything to you, Magos? I glared at the cyborg. Get out of my sight. I dismissed him and turned my ire on the other tech cultists. Now, you bunch. Anyone volunteering as firing squad target? Volunteer number 1, who had no less than 24 weapons aimed at him, an achievement in itself in the small hospital room, let out a string of binary at me, which prompted a few of his or her friends to begin cursing us as well. That's uncalled for. The reasonable cogboy, Scipio Row 11, I think, snapped at his buddies. Magos, I have the sneaking suspicion that if you translate what they're chanting, I'll have them summarily shot without a second thought. Am I right? While it's your right, Inquisitor, we do need every tech priest we have, Scipio Row implored. I'm aware of that, Magos. What I'm not convinced of is the utility of this bunch. Can we trust them not to sabotage the war effort or try to engineer a confrontation with our allies? Distasteful or not, our alliance with the Necrons is likely going to be the one thing that keeps Kronus from falling to actual heretics and traitors. Even as I spoke, I wondered at how oddly calm I felt. After I just found out that I was mind-fucked, I knew I should be having all kinds of logical and expected reactions, like freaking out of my mind, for example. The training I could remember would have helped mitigate it somewhat, however not to this extent. Was this an artifact left from the memories that someone took from me, or a consequence of the procedure that did it? Well, obviously I wasn't all right, despite the odd cold calmness gripping me right now. Scipio Row 11 was speaking, yet my mind failed to register his first words. Supervision. I'll personally make sure that they will act exemplary as members of the cult mechanics always must. I focused my attention on the cogboy while trying my best to keep my mind on point. I'll hold you up to this promise, Magos. See to it and get them out of my sight as well. I sent my best glare at the Martians, who were still busy cursing me in binary. Scipio Row bowed to me, muttering his gratitude, and turned to face his rogue minions before he blasted in deafening binary at them. I didn't bother paying attention to the exchange, but instead looked at Charles. Commissar, I want people watching our Mechanicus contingent just in case. I'll see to it, my lord. Good. In that case, let's go see the Ogrins before they decide to bring down the building on our heads. I slowly stood up, finding that my feet weren't particularly steady. What a joy. While Scipio was still busy berating his minions, I checked if all my appendages still worked as advertised, slowly and carefully, so I wouldn't make a complete fool of me if they didn't. With everything being mostly in order, I looked around for my equipment, which I found put in a corner of the room, almost completely hidden by Antia's bulk. The good news was that the cogboys decided not to commit an expensive suicide right now, but instead continue to be a pain in my arse in the future and piled out of the room, while still cursing in binary. They're going to be trouble, I muttered to myself. Then why did you let them live, Inquisitor? Antias asked. Politics and the fact that we do indeed need every one of the toaster-fucking bastards for the time being, I grumbled in response and squeezed past the librarian to get my gear. What's a toaster? Someone asked. I paused at that. I wish I knew the answer. Nevertheless, I turned my head in the general direction of the voice and spoke in a deadpan tone. Something the cogboys gleefully fuck that is most certainly not meant for fucking. That actually makes a twisted kind of sense. Antaeus wisely nodded. Are you really all right, Inquisitor? I'm as well as I can be given the circumstances, I admitted after putting my sword on my belt. I attached my pistol's holster on the other side, grabbed the various odds and ends Karam had removed for the examination, and pocketed them. That's not particularly reassuring. Antaeus pressed on. I'm well aware of that. I nodded in agreement. Work first, an existential crisis later, preferably when we have the time to safely drain a few bottles of Amasec. I can get behind that plan, Weber pipped up. Excellent, then you're buying the first round during the victory celebrations. I declared with false cheer and ponderously headed for the door. My stormtrooper bodyguards fanned, moved in front of me, scanning for threats. As soon as the cogboys' beeping faded out, I could hear the angry grumbling of Ogryns coming from outside. I hastened my steps as much as I dared and soon reached the entrance, where Corporal Santos and his troopers fanned out, forming a thin barrier between me and what appeared to be a huge crowd. This was indeed what looked suspiciously like a mechanized battalion surrounding the hospital, though there was a large free space in front where the Ogryns were gathered, all of them armed and armored to the teeth. I could also see a lot of curious locals staring at us from the windows of nearby buildings, though the streets were clear of civilians. This was a proper circus, only the Necrons were missing, though I was pretty sure they had a handful of cloaked machines watching the show. As you can see, I am very much alive and in my right mind, I declared aloud, happy that my voice didn't crack. And I'm very fucking disappointed, I added, though my words got swallowed by the deafening cheers of the Ogryns, who happily waved their guns around. At least they managed not to shoot someone by accident. As soon as I had that thought, one of the Ogryns got a bit too excited and discharged his assault shotgun. He failed to take out someone's head. Instead, by pure luck or the Emperor's design, succeeded in nailing a familiar-looking scarab-like machine, which fell to the ground covered by green lighting. Predictably, at that point, everyone got their weapons at the ready and either aimed at the Ogryns or at anything that might be a cloaked Necron machine. The celebrating Ogryns naturally returned the favor, producing an armed standoff. My bodyguards were not outdone and formed a live shield in front of me, while Antaeus towered behind us and I could sense him drawing on warp energies. Fuck my life, what in the Emperor's name did I do to deserve this? Part 2. Victory Bay Kronus. Honestly, stunts like these gave birth to particularly treacherous rumors and various not sufficiently patriotic movies that as often as not get the local arbiters busy cracking heads. And that was a tangent my mind had no business going at, while everyone pointed guns at each other. Commissar Weber. My voice came out of my lips as a quiet hiss. It appears a lot of people need remedial weapon discipline training. I looked at the troopers watching each other warily and felt my facial scars stretch uncomfortably when my eyes began to twitch from sheer vexation. It appears so, Inquisitor. My bloodthirsty acquaintance promptly agreed. In the Emperor's name, stand the fuck down. My voice snapped like a whip. Commissars, deal with this. Some remedial training is in the order, I reckon. I shook my head at the sheer bloody idiocy of what just happened and gave my best disappointed look to the Ogryns. After that, I marched towards a nearby chimera, determined to requisition it and go see what mischief the Necrons were up to. Not to mention, I had to explain how they lost a drone because of an itchy trigger finger. My bodyguards fell in formation around me, with Antaeus effortlessly striding behind us. Meanwhile, Weber began issuing orders to the nearby commissars, which would hopefully ensure there would be no more such embarrassing and dangerous incidents. Now, if it only could be so easy to deal with the Necrons and Bloodravens before we got another shooting or stabbing incident. We pilled up in a transport I promptly requisitioned. Antaeus, where is the technology our allies provided? One of the tech priest's compounds near General Alexander's HQ. Driver, get us to the HQ. Antaeus, what's that rumbling I'm hearing, because we aren't shooting at each other? I asked the librarian, who barely fit at the back of the chimera. We left as fast as the chimera could accelerate, with a space marine weighing it down. Behind us, I could barely hear the screams of pissed-off commissars. It was like music to my ears. We spent the next 20 minutes or so in a comfortable silence, which offered me some sorely needed time to get my head straightened up as much as possible. Various mental exercises and quiet prayers to the Emperor helped a bit. The latter even earned me a few nervous smiles from the troopers stuck inside with us. A wave of static electricity washed over me, focusing my mind on the here and now. It was a weird sensation, like nothing I've experienced before. The energy wasn't physical, I found out a moment later. It didn't touch my skin, instead it clashed over and around my soul. With every passing moment, the ever-present sensation of wrongness and power emanated from the warp storm nearby felt more distant, losing their grip on me. My eyes widened, and I warily attempted to touch the immaterium. It felt distant, more distant than ever, and with every passing heartbeat, that distance increased. I was sure that very soon it would be out of my reach. At the same time, I could feel the walls separating the materium and immaterium strengthen, in a way that was similar, yet not to a Geller field in action. A couple of minutes later, the warp was little more than a distinct echo. For the first time since I could remember, I could breathe easily, as if a great weight no longer pressed upon my whole being. Soon the effect became apparent even to the troopers, who were lucky enough not to have a clear connection with hell itself in their souls. The guardsmen and women in the Chimera looked around, more lively and, dare I say, light-hearted than before. "The device is indeed working, Inquisitor," Antaeus rumbled. I nodded with a smile. It was a game-changer. And I would be damned if I wasn't going to throw it in the faces of the damned traitors we would soon be facing. When we reached the Martians' compound with the nice Necron devices and disembarked, it was immediately clear their effect was great for the morale. Even with groups of Necron scarabs and other assorted drones flying around, not to mention a group of their infantry standing at attention near the entrance, the soldiers dug in nearby were all in a much better mood than they had any right to be. I had never paused to think about how the warp might passively affect regular people, especially when there weren't friendly warp-touched entities or artifacts to boost their morale. You know, like the odd imperial saint or relic. This was certainly something worth studying in the future, if we didn't get all shot as heretics for dabbling in what we shouldn't have. A couple of minutes later, we were inside and past the security checkpoints. The heart of the building was one giant workshop. A large monolith made of the same stuff the Necrons were built of stood as the centerpiece. Thick cables connected it to a pair of portable plasma generators through crude attachments. Green lighting forked up and down its surface, and I could feel energy resonating with my very soul as I approached it. While it wasn't exactly uncomfortable, I would never call the sensation pleasant either. Groups of Martians chanted in binary, a few of them knelt reverently in front of the monolith, while others took readings with all kinds of sensors. Incense burned all around the workshop, and to top it all, servo skulls flew around carrying smoking sticks of it. At least no one was spraying the device with blessed oil, though there was a pair of toaster fuckers with what suspiciously looked like sprayers ready nearby. A single Necron Praetorian stood proudly close by, and if I didn't know better, I would swear he was rolling its solid glowing eyes. "Inquisitor," the Necron announced in a toneless synthetic voice, "you're alive." The Praetorian turned to look at me. "And you appear more or less sane." He lowered his head a bit to look at me closer. "Or so it appears. Please explain, this—" He pointed clawed fingers at the Martians, who were all too busy with their religious fervor to pay us any attention. Sadly, ever since the fall of the Human Federation, these are what passes for our scientists and engineers. My facial muscles twitched at the very idea. By treaty and out of desperation, I added. I wasn't sure where those words came from. What I knew was that sooner or later I would be paying for them. Praise the Omnissiah. By the motive force. That much I understood. The gleeful beeping I was reasonably sure I didn't want a translation of. The Necron looked at the Martians, then back at me. "You don't say, Inquisitor. I'm glad you've lived up to your part of our bargain. How many of these devices can you have operational for when we strike at the Deimos Peninsula? Their ability to wall off access to the warp is going to be invaluable." "Not as many as we would like." The Necron rumbled in a deep voice that was a passable imitation of Antaea's deep baritone. I find myself curious. From what we've been able to figure out, your kind is supposed to be frothing at the mouth because of our very presence and stirring up the locals on a crusade against us on general principle. Didn't we agree that I'm a sane Inquisitor? Don't worry, when our respective reinforcements arrive, we'll probably have to either kill each other or get blasted from orbit on general principle. The Necron simply stared at me, while Antaeus groaned. It's a good thing you aren't a diplomat, Inquisitor. There's that. Yet what I just said is unfortunately to be our future. On the bright side, before we get blasted from orbit, we might ruin the Chaos's day and avoid getting our souls devoured by demons. So there's that. My lord provisionally agrees. When reinforcements arrive, all bets are going to be off. The Necron concluded. On the bright side, we might get lucky. Sanity and common sense might for once rear up their ugly heads. I find that unlikely. The Necron decided to rain on my parade. I find myself in the uncomfortable position of agreeing with the Xeno. Antes pipped up. Let me have my delusions until I got thrown up into an inquisitorial interrogation chamber or shot on general principle. At any rate, before we might suffer such auspicious ends, we have work to do. Antaeus, my friend, please get the attention of a few of our Martian friends. I need to ask them a few questions. Chapter 10, Parts 3 and 4. Chapter 10, Tonight We Dine in Hell. Part 3, Unknown Location. Kronus, a crack of displaced air and blinding red lighting heralded Gorgut's, Ed Unter's return to the Materium. In his expert opinion, it was a letdown. There was no one to crump or shoot around, no fighting whatsoever. It was cold too, and everything appeared covered in that odd white stuff that mech boys could melt and turn into proper booze if they had enough rocket fuel to play with. Speaking about booze, Gorguts brought his mug up and downed it, enjoying the fiery stinging sensation of the liquid washing down his throat. Finishing his drink made the last uncomfortable ache in his back went away. He looked around, still no one and nothing to bash over the head. Gorguts shrugged and took another pull from his mug, savouring the drink. His memories from meeting Gork and Mork were already fading. However, he could clearly recall the really important bits and pieces. A big crumping wah would be happening in a place called Koruva, or something like that. Gorguts would be there having the time of his life. However, first, he had some work to do. It simply wouldn't do to get blasted from space. It really wouldn't, though it might be fun to do it to the Humiers next time. Gorguts had to find an answer to that problem. He wanted to lead another huge horde against the Humier. Well, first, he had to find a way off this rock. Perhaps a rocket, or better, a rocket. There might be a few useful boys left here and there to pick up as well. Gorguts drained his mug again, without thinking about it. He was already deep in thought, you see. Naturally, he didn't think about how odd his contemplation was, for an orc anyway. Gorguts most definitely didn't think that his thoughts were crystal clear, despite the booze he kept chugging, or the fact that he was, well, an orc. Deep and detailed planning had never been his kind's strength. Yet that was precisely what he was doing, while confidently striding through snow-capped mountains. Chaos fortifications, Deimos Peninsula. There were very few things in the Materium that could make a Dark Apostle wary. A sorcerer clawing out his eyes and gurgling in tongues wasn't one of them. This being the third one who tried to divine what the corpse worshippers were up to, well, it made him think appropriately dark thoughts. Eliphas wasn't happy, on the contrary. The carefully nurtured and expertly turned PDF regiment he sent to secure the demon's binding place was busy playing tag with blood ravens and surprisingly effective guard soldiers. The Dark Apostle briefly thought this was just typical PDF idiocy at play, then remembered that the Four had blessed that particular regiment, so that couldn't be it. Competent corpse worshippers in need of murdering it were, then. Eliphas nodded to himself. Now what to do about it? He looked through narrowed eyes at a nearby building painted with all kinds of pleasantly glowing chaos symbols. That was where he had the new batch of willing sacrifices gather to await deployment. There were almost enough of those. The issue was they needed some innocent ones as well, and those were much, much harder to find. Damn that green-skinned brute to the deepest, darkest parts of the warp. Eliphas made a point to check on the area's security just in case of more orc mishaps or other unlikely trouble. Only then he returned to overseeing the bickering sorcerers, the remaining ones anyway. There was a fourth one writhing on the ground and frothing at the mouth after trying to brute force his way to some answers. That, combined with the machine abominations, didn't paint a pretty picture. First, no blood for the blood god. Not good. Second, no souls to send screaming to the fore. That was even worse, obviously. The Necrons were the real problem. With them around, the Dark Apostle didn't dare send a meaningful portion of his forces to deal with the corpse worshippers or even take and hold the area where the greater demon was imprisoned. Doing so before he could have enough forces both to protect his base of operations and especially the warp gate and send a strong enough expeditionary force might prove fatal. That was why he sent the PDF regiment. They were both expendable and, at least in theory, tough enough to have a chance of holding and keeping the important real estate. I need to know what the corpse worshippers and those soulless abominations are planning. Eliphas roared at his diminishing supply of sorcerers. He drew his blessed crosium and smashed the skull of the still frothing at the mouth imbecile. Get me results, or I'll personally deliver your skulls to Khorne. Eliphas left the sorcerers with that heartfelt promise and marched towards the warp gate. He was going to assess again what he had available, trying to figure out a reasonable way to achieve his mission. Failure was not an option. In theory, the various ongoing rituals all over the peninsula should soon make it close to impenetrable for the Necron's damned technological sorcery. Once that was done, in theory, he would be able to wield many of the disjointed war bands and groups of cultists that kept coming through the gate, not to mention the warp spawn. The problem was that in theory was far from enough. He had to free the greater demon and either feed this world to it or ensure it retreated through the warp gate if Kronus couldn't be held. Eliphas passed by sacrificial altars, felt pulses of blood magic wash over him, and smiled. With those particular defenses up, no mortal could approach the gate. Each pulse was strong enough to strip the flesh of a mortal not enjoying the blessings of the four, and a second one would send their souls screaming to the devoured. Those same defenses might do absolutely nothing to even slow down the abominable machines. That, though, stripped away the Dark Apostle's smile. That was the reason why there were many more altars spread all over the place with hundreds of locals ritually sacrificed while thousands more awaited their fate. As far as the Eliphas was concerned, soon couldn't come fast enough. Part 4. Upper Wastes, Kronus. Rohan's forces achieved their first objective as soon as they left the labyrinth that was the webway. For a brief moment, all anyone could see was a frozen stark wasteland. Next, the Eldari registered the sorcery cloaking everything around them. Technology and spells from the handful of warlocks riding on top of the grav tanks rent the veil, allowing them to perceive the truth. The Bieltan's contingent had established their operations base right on top of the gateway, thus risking exposing its location. There weren't many of them present, a handful of guards spread all over the place, some fixed defenses and a group of snow-covered walkers towering in the distance. The warmonger's response was slow and sluggish. Rohan already had half his tanks through the gate, and the infantry riding on them dismounted and ready by the time a wide-eyed guardian challenged their incursion. The Bieltan warrior first to encounter them was very young, little more than a boy, really. There was no trace of his helmet, a fact partially explained by a fresh, severe burn covering part of his face and right side of the head. The ghastly wound had received some basic treatment, likely just enough to prevent infection, nothing more. "Where is Taldir?" Rohan hissed more harshly than he intended. The more he saw and experienced from this place, the worse his option of the disaster became. An aura of shock and defeat surrounded the whole area, clinging to it harder than the ice gripping the ground below his armored boots. The youth slowly raised a hand and pointed at a nearby Wraithbone building. "My thanks, warrior," Rohan said in a gentler tone. He briefly looked at the warlock riding on top of the grav tank beside him. "Deploy our forces to secure the area. I want real-time intelligence of the surrounding regions." Rohan went to find his sister, doing his best to get his temper under control. He didn't know for sure what forces the warmongers deployed to Kronus. What he knew was he could see their shattered remains, and they were a pitiful sight. The building he entered was an armory, which was now empty of most weaponry and ordnance, highlighting the losses Biel-Tan suffered so far. Now it served a different primary purpose, that of a hospital. Wounded Eldari laid or sat in the corridors and rooms Rohan passed by. Some were left alone, healing themselves through a psychic trance. Others had guardians and the odd aspect warrior doing their best to keep them alive. Anger burned within the ranger's heart at the sight of so many broken Eldari who suffered for no good reason. He finally found Taldir at the far end of the armory. The room supposed to hold heavy weaponry had been stripped bare and turned into yet another healing point. Taldir laid in a corner, looking small and fragile. Seeing her that way reminded Rohan just how young and inexperienced his sister was. Yet that hasn't stopped the fools at Biel-Tan from giving her an independent command. Taldir stirred when he approached. In the artificial light, her hair looked like a smoldering flame. Her skin was paler than the snow outside. She slowly opened her eyes and stared at him without recognition. "Sister," Rohan greeted quietly. His voice sounded tired and resigned to his ears. "What had you wrought?" "Rohan?" Slowly, a spark of life and recognition appeared in her empty eyes. "It's me, sister. What happened?" "The Mon-Ki and the soulless abominations. They slaughtered us." Taldir spoke slowly, haltingly. Her voice was chock full of pain and disbelief. "I'll need more than that, Farseer." Even though Rohan knew better, he couldn't help it and snap. He wasn't just angry with Taldir, but with himself as well. Perhaps if he had stayed behind, or found some way to get his sister away from those maniacs. What-ifs didn't matter. He wasn't a damned Farseer. Rohan left his sister behind, and now he had to pick up the pieces if it was at all possible. Taldir simply stared up at him, and the spark of recognition in her eyes burned out. The dull, empty look was back. Mon-Ki, Tau, and Orc infestations detected on arrival. Divination pointed at possible Necron awakening. We needed to secure the planet and prepare to neutralize Necron threat without distractions. Taldir began her report like an automaton. The path was obvious. Direct the lesser species to kill off each other, sweep off the survivors, and then neutralize the real threat. Stirred Orcs and pointed at Mon-Ki. The brutes failed. Convinced local Tau forces to assault Mon-Ki positions to provide distraction and expend their offensive forces. At that point, Taldir halted her matter-of-fact monologue and flinched. Mon-Ki allied with the abominations. It was a trap. The Farseer shook and stared intently at Rohan. "It was a trap," she repeated. "We slaughtered the Mon-Ki until the streets ran red with blood. They didn't break." She became more and more frantic as she spoke. Her eyes looked through Rohan, seeing the bloody past. The beasts kept coming. Then the Necrons struck. Taldir all but screamed. "They slaughtered us. It isn't right. We're Eldari. The galaxy is our birthright. It's not right." At that moment, Rohan had never been more grateful for the helm he wore. It hid the way he blanched at seeing his sister fall apart in such a way. One thing was certain, he wasn't getting a better report from her any time soon. "Rest, Taldir. The monsters are far away," he said in his best soothing tone. Taldir's face twitched twice before she laid back on the ground and visibly relaxed. Yet, all the same, she kept muttering, "It isn't right." Rohan had to consciously keep himself from running while he made his way out of the building. That was... He focused upon the tenets of his chosen path and began to rapidly recite them in his mind. The familiar monotony of the action was like a soothing balm to his frayed soul. This, all of this, was at least in part his fault. What happened to his little sister most of all? Taldir should never have been here, much less leading this disaster of a mission. He spent a few moments to calm down and focus before striding towards the closest hale Biel-Tan warrior. Rohan needed better answers than Taldir could currently provide. Once he had them and knew exactly what he was dealing with, he had to find a way to fix this. He had to. Anything less was simply unthinkable. Chapter 10, Parts 5 and 6. Chapter 10, Tonight We Dine in Hell. Part 5, Victory Bay Kronus. We ended up at the Martian facility, where our tech cultists were busy thinking inappropriate thoughts at the Necron pylon. Steaming sanctified lubrication oil covered it from the tip to the wide foundation. There was enough incense in the air to make it hard to see. It was even harder to breathe without a respirator. I narrowed my eyes at the now gleaming pylon and prayed to him on holy terror. This had to simply be proper sanctified oil I saw, and not other tech priest-supplied fluids. That's a bit much, Antias concluded. At least he had no trouble breathing. The benefits of space marine biology. How did you survive long enough to leave your homeworld? I'll never know. Our Necron tag-along stated flatly. Legend has it that we had proper scientists back in the day. I felt compelled to explain. We didn't need to pray and try sanctify everything to avoid chaos corruption. It's the Eldari fault then. The Necron nodded wisely. When in doubt, it's a safe bet to blame them. Antias agreed. Honestly, it was a surprise we haven't tried to kill each other yet, or that no one tried to ventilate our brains out of fear that we were heretics. Then again, let's not tempt fate, I thought. Right now, the Eldar aren't our primary concern, I pointed out. Nevertheless, being right next to the pylon might make the heretics and traitors' job a bit harder, so it was a win-win situation, a rare thing indeed. Our plan to deal with the Chaos incursion is still viable, I hope, I asked the Necron. The Immortal nodded. With you alive, Inquisitor, my lord believes the human forces on Kronus will uphold their part of the bargain. The operation will proceed as scheduled. That's good. I could really use some good news after the latest debacle. With that settled, any suggestions on how we don't end killing each other if we survive the coming battle? I might as well try a bit of positive thinking and see where it might get me. Unsurprisingly, everyone in earshot stared at me as if I suddenly grew up a second head or some other mutated appendage. I know it might be hard to process, Inquisitor, but we might try not shooting at each other. That might be a good starting point. The Necron stated in a tone that might have held the tiniest bit of exasperation. If it was only so easy, I chuckled. The murder machines had a sense of humor, who knew? Why not? The Immortal inquired. Blistering streams of binary came from the resident Martians. They waved mechadendrites in agitation, and I'm sure it was a pure coincidence that they pointed a lot of sharp instruments our way. It's a very long story, and I'm sure that at least some parts of it make sense. I nodded at the towering Immortal and blithely turned my back to it. Now you, my Martian friends. I smiled at the tech priests. Please convince me that those rumors I heard were baseless speculation. It couldn't be true that many among your ranks refused to study and figure out how to replicate the technological wonders our allies of convenience provided, right? This time the angry beeping and whining were deafening. All kinds of weird weapons joined the various implements on display, and the agitation I could see among the Martians was something else. That wasn't surprising. From what little I could gather lately, Magos Scipio Rho 11 was among the competent and forward-thinking faction of the Martians. That, in turn, meant he had like-minded tech priests attending the pylon and other Necron-sourced toys. Thus, this particular crowd was anything but happy at the very idea of someone or something infringing upon their newfound treasure trove. Wise or not, I kept on edging them. It couldn't be that some tech priests are ready to destroy everything within this chamber and dismantle anyone who thought studying it was a good idea. By now my smile was a thin, wintry thing that held no trace of amusement. Because if that was the case, I would be forced to discharge my duties as an Inquisitor, and it would be regrettable. It would be for the best if this doctrinal dispute is resolved as an internal mechanicus manner. At this point, Scipio Rho 11 raced into the chamber, whistling like a speeding train. I looked at the Magos, and whatever he saw on my face gave him pause. Is that right, Magos? Can I rely on you and your peers to resolve your doctrinal dispute by the end of the day? You know what we're about to face. We can't afford internal disruptions. For the next few minutes, a never-ending chorus of binary surrounded us. I stoically watched the exchange, wondering if I just made a terrible mistake. Mechadendrites shook like branches picked up by a hurricane. The piercing beeping became physically painful, and with every passing moment, the Martians pulled out more and more weapons from under their robes. There were even a couple of tarantula turrets that run up one wall before attaching themselves to the ceiling. And just like that, the screaming match in binary ceased, leaving behind just the familiar rumble of machinery. Lord Inquisitor Vale, you're making a good point. Scipio Row 11 straightened up his robes with bionic fingers. We will have words with our more conservative compatriots. I'm glad to hear you say this, Magos. May the Omnissiah bless your efforts. He studied me for a few moments before nodding and turning around. Follow me, brethren, in the name of the Omnissiah, he declared aloud and followed in binary. All but a handful of Martians left brandishing all kinds of weaponry. The tarantula turrets detached themselves from the ceiling, spun in the air to land on their stubby feet, and followed suit. Inquisitor, I hope you know what you're doing, Antius whispered behind my back. Me too, I muttered back. A loud clang echoed above me. I turned around and saw the priceless sight of a face-palming Necron immortal. How in the name of the Silent King did your kind become the dominant species of this era? By the grace and sacrifice of people much better than any of us, I answered honestly, and by the sacrifice of the God Emperor himself. I saw Antius nod in approval while the Necron muttered something in an unfamiliar language. Enough of this. Let's go see what new disaster we might yet prevent. We just managed to leave the building when the immortal froze for a moment. There is a single Eldari grav tank heading our way. It's carrying one of their rangers on top. And he is holding a white flag. The Necron looked down at me. Our drones just picked a transmission in the clear from the Eldari. They want to talk. It's a trap. Has to be, Antius decided. We concur. The immortal agreed. Fucking Eldar. Part 6. Outskirts of Victory Bay, Kronus. Rohan looked morosely at the crude Mon Key. No human saw excuse for architecture and wanted to scream in frustration. Call them humans. He had to remind himself again. His kind's usual superior attitude, no matter how justified or well-earned it might be, wouldn't serve him well today. He saw firsthand the fruits of that sort of thinking. Even now, those fools who failed to consider the debacle might have been primarily their fault. No matter how much he pondered Taldir's choices, he came to the same conclusion. They were born of unthinking arrogance and blind following of the visions his little sister saw in the Sea of Souls. Even he knew that such divination, while useful, were never to be taken at face value. Unfortunately, that was a lesson often lost upon the Farseers. It didn't help that most of the time their visions did pan out. It was just that when they didn't. Smoothly the grav tank Rohan drove up a hill, and he could finally see the human settlement in the distance. It was ugly, crude, and dirty, like almost all human settlements he had the misfortune to visit in person. There were no comforting gentle curves, no wraithbone pillars resonating with energy, and the psychic presence of the humans it simply grated. He could swear there was an aura of hatred and single-mindedness permeating the whole region. Or perhaps he was projecting his own opinion on the average human he had seen. As expected, there was a greeting party on a trampled field outside of the city. A couple of the red boxy tanks preferred by the Space Marines, several primitive scout walkers, and a couple of dozen dug-in heavy weapon teams formed an honor guard for the delegation waiting for him. Rohan focused his attention on the small group of humans waiting to meet him. One of their armored giants towered above the rest, holding a power hammer. A dangerous foe in close range, one the ranger would never engage in close quarters if he had a choice. Next, it was one of the human political officers needed to keep the rabble making the bulk of their forces in line. Under most circumstances, the commissar would be a priority target to take out, which usually had devastating consequences for the morale of the humans nearby. Finally, a step ahead of the others stood an Inquisitor. From what Rohan could gather, it was that human's fault that the Bieltan contingent failed spectacularly. He didn't bother hiding a sneer at that thought. Even now, those fools failed to consider the debacle might have been primarily their fault. Of course not. It was the despicable Mon Key to blame. To make their failure complete, many of the survivors swore an eternal vendetta against the humans they held responsible for what happened. It was pathetic, really, and almost physically painful to see how far his people had fallen. Well, not precisely his people, because he did have the good sense to leave Bieltan behind when the opportunity presented itself. The grav tank gently came to a stop a respectful distance from the humans, and Rohan nimbly jumped from his perch next to the main cannon. He landed lightly on his feet and walked towards the people waiting for him, projecting confidence. "That's far enough, Eldar," the Space Marine barked. Rohan halted and gave a closer look to the trio. He couldn't sense them with his psychic gift, which granted wasn't particularly strong. There was a ravenous void where those three stood, almost like a black hole hungrily devouring the Sea of Souls itself. What did the humans or the Necrons for that matter do this time? Was this even more than a disaster than he knew? At that point, a tiny human figure poked its head from behind the knees of the giant in red and stared at him with huge, curious eyes. It was all Rohan could do not to recoil at the sight of the human child. Laying his eyes on her provoked a profound sense of revulsion and not a little fear. "Humans, what did you do?" the ranger hissed, all his hasty plans for the meeting forgotten. "Who are you, and why are you here?" the Inquisitor rudely demanded. Rohan shook himself at those words. He was an experienced Eldari ranger. Whatever that childlike abomination was, its presence was no excuse for such a lapse in judgment or manners for that matter. "I'm Ranger Rohan, representing Craftworld Ulthway," he declared proudly. It wasn't like the humans didn't know his allegiance. Both his armor and the tank proudly wore the emblem of their chosen home. "Inquisitor Vale, Ordo Xenos. It's most certainly not a pleasure to make you acquaintance. What mischief are you up to, Eldar?" The relatively short, rude human introduced himself. "I'm here to offer an apology on behalf of Farseer Eldrad, Craftworld Ulthway's Farseer Council, and every sane Eldar in the galaxy." Rohan bit out. His words didn't come out as smoothly as they should have. However, the presence of the little abomination had him on edge. Rohan nearly ground his teeth to dust in order not to do something particularly foolish. "We should believe you, why exactly?" The human had the gall to sound amused. He even cracked a smile that stretched his fresh facial scars in a grotesque parody. Rohan opened his mouth to snap at the Mon key, then closed it with a snap, thankfully muffled by his helmet. This was actually a good question, especially because of Bieltan's recent mishandling of the local situation. "I'm ready to pledge the Ulthway forces I brought with me for the battle against the Primordial Annihilator. I also have intelligence about one of its objectives on this world. A powerful demon is imprisoned below the desert, no too far from here." Rohan struggled to speak with the gravitas required of an Eldari of his station. He was representing his people not only in front of the humans, but the Necrons who undoubtedly observed and waited for an excuse to pounce at them. "A demon. Of course, there is going to be a demon here," the Inquisitor grumbled. The human didn't sound surprised, mind you, merely resigned. "How curious. Besides those pouring through that warp gate," the giant added, "or those the heretics are busy summoning." The Commissar spoke for the first time too. "Yes, besides those." The Inquisitor's dry voice made Rohan look at the humans more closely. Unsurprisingly, the Space Marine was a towering armored statue that betrayed nothing even with an abomination hiding behind him. The Commissar did a good job of not glancing nervously at the little human-shaped monster. However, his unease at the situation was clear to see. The Inquisitor, on the other hand, it was obvious that the only things the human was wary of were Rohan, the grav tank, and potential treachery from the Eldari. He showed no visible sign that the little abomination affected him at all. Yet, according to the Bieltan survivors, he was a Psyker. Rohan clamped down on the burning desire to demand an explanation from the humans. What have they done to themselves? "We will hear more about this demon." The Inquisitor's words shifted back Rohan's attention to the task at hand. "If you're willing to pledge forces for the battle with the heretics, they'll have to lead the way. None of us will trust Eldar at our backs, especially after they used their so-called Tau allies as little more than cannon fodder." Rohan grit his teeth even harder. This wasn't the time and place to declare every single Eldari life was beyond precious and more valuable than hordes of lesser beings. Even hinting he agreed with that accepted fact wouldn't go down well with the humans, he knew that much. Chapter 10. Part 7-8. Chapter 10, Tonight We Dine in Hell. Part 7, Outskirts of Victory Bay, Kronus. My rage grew further and further until it was a boiling maelstrom of barely controlled fury. It was fortunate that thanks to the Munchkin hiding behind Antaeus's knees, I couldn't touch the warp, even if my life depended on it. In this state, I would be vulnerable to the various demons clawing at the walls of reality. The reason for my rage, our new Eldar acquaintance and the news he brought. To my best knowledge, that entity had been imprisoned for the past 10,000 years or so. It is beneath the desert region known as the Ares Badlands. Properly releasing it requires a long ritual with willing sacrifices being a key ingredient. This explains the enemy's actions. A Necron drone decloaked above my right shoulder and spoke with the voice of that poor bastard Maccabee. I was pretty sure that the Eldar stiffened at the device's appearance, however, it was hard to say for sure. He did look like he had swallowed a pole arm, and so far did nothing to dissuade that notion. The drone projected a short skirmish between a familiar huge green beast and the traitors. That thing simply refuses to die, I concluded after watching the recording. Gorguts was very much alive. I wasn't going to assume that the war boss would be lost for good in the warp again. We might have to deal with an orc resurgence sooner rather than later. The beasts will still need time to replenish their numbers and build a sufficient number of their scrap weaponry to become a credible threat, Antaeus reasonably pointed out. We should be able to deal with the heretics before the greenskin become a credible threat again. Because of this new intelligence, my lord believes that one of the vehicles destroyed in that engagement carried the willing sacrifices for the ritual. At least the orcs were useful this one time, I concluded. I need to consult my people before making a decision on your suggestion about an alliance against the Chaos Forces, Ranger Rohan. If we find it agreeable, we'll require your available units to operate where we can see them. Further, it would be unacceptable to let them operate in our rear areas. After the last few days, we're trusting your kind even less than usual, if that is even possible. Antaeus spoke for all of us. That might be agreeable, the Eldar said flatly. That one wasn't a happy camper. On a related topic, can we get to the demon without a ritual? I looked at the Munchkin. She needed a name. Then I glanced at the drone. Between our little friend here and your technology, would it be possible to lock it out from the warp and end it once and for all? The drone bobbed up and down, but didn't immediately answer. Such a thing should be impossible even with the aid of a powerful pariah. Antaeus rumbled thoughtfully. However, the Necron pylons have a curious effect upon the immaterium. It might be theoretically possible. You humans are insane, the Eldar declared with conviction. That's rich coming from you. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep going on a rant. Your kind has more experience with the immaterium and its inhabitants than most of us. Is it possible to kill the demon for good? The ranger twitched and turned his helmet to stare at Antaeus's knees. Our little resident blank poked her head around the librarian's bulk and stared back at the Eldar. As far as I know, it should be impossible. His voice faltered. Yet an abomination with such a powerful effect upon the Sea of Souls shouldn't exist either. He shuddered, and it was plain to see. That's not a nice thing to say. I turned to look at the kid. Sweetie, the rude knife-eared man, I bit off a curse, didn't mean it. The Munchkin glared at the Eldar, which was an improvement, I was sure of it, then hid behind Antaeus. You'd think they would teach you manners back on your craft world, I chided. That's rich coming from a barbarian human who had the gall to ally with the Necrons of all things. I see that despite all you've wrought, the Eldari's arrogance is still running strong. The Necron's mouthpiece shot back. I think that a brief recess to calm down and discuss the situation would be for the best, I declared, trying to be diplomatic. I concur. The ranger stated coldly, turned around, and marched to the waiting grav tank. We pilled up in a chimera that waited for us nearby and headed for the city, where General Alexander and company waited for us. Soon we were at a heavy defended forward command post, surrounded by patrolling servo skulls and Necron drones. The general was inside along with a large part of his retinue. Scipio Row 11 joined us before we could begin discussing the situation, looking worse to wear. Half his mechadendrites were missing, and while he wore a pristine brand-new robe, it did little to hide the stench of melted metal, burned oil, and scorched flesh. The doctrinal differences between the Mechanicus contingent on Kronus have been resolved. We're permanently down 38% of our tech priests, with 15% more needing extensive maintenance. I regret to inform you of the loss of 20% of maintenance equipment and spare parts. That could have gone better, or much worse for that matter. General Alexander glared at me. "Inquisitor, what were you thinking?" he demanded. "That we couldn't afford fanatics among our Mechanicus contingent sabotaging us at the worst possible moment. Giving leave to loyal Mechanicus elements to resolve their doctrinal issues themselves were the best option in my opinion. If necessary, our Scarab drones can offer field maintenance and repair." The Necron drone pipped up. If I didn't know better, which I didn't, in this case I could swear that the modulated voice held more than a hint of amusement. "Carrying on," Captain Thule cleared his throat aloud. The sound had more in common with a displeased large predator than anything that should leave human lungs. "What are we going to do about the Eldar?" An alliance of convenience has some merit. If nothing else, every single one of the bastards we can see and is out in the front is one less Eldar causing havoc in our rear areas. At any rate, we'll have to leave even more security forces to cover Victory Bay than anticipated, I summarized. "I concur," General Alexander grimaced. "Besides, every Eldar the traitors shoot at might mean they aren't shooting at one of my soldiers. That said, I'm not trusting them to uphold their part of the bargain. Then we should be ready to stab them in the back before they can do the same to us," Captain Thule calmly concluded. "That's the standard operating procedure when dealing with Eldar, even the few friendly ones," I added. "Thoughts about the demon below the Ares Badlands?" The Blood Raven's commander grimaced at that. "The chapter master dispatched us here to recover various archaeotech and chapter relics. A number of them are supposed to be somewhere in that region at the buried remains of Heresy-era battlefields. This information isn't filling me with confidence, Captain. Honestly, the Inquisition has begun investigations over much less. Is that the real reason why your Astartes shot at my people repeatedly?" Alexander demanded. He didn't roar his question, not quite. However, an Orc war boss would have been proud to bellow like him. Captain Thule stoically stared at us, but refused to say anything more on that particular topic. "We'll discuss that later." I interrupted the hostile staring match. "Demons, Necron pylons, and our resident Blank," said Blank currently waited for us just outside munching on an MRE. "Your suggestion sounds insane, Inquisitor," Alexander's chief psyker said in a tired voice. "However, to the best of my knowledge, no one has had access to both a powerful Blank and this kind of technology. Not at the same time and place anyway. It might work, or at least allow us to banish demons much easier than we have any right to." "We should be able to test it," Maccabi suggested. "There's that. I'm sure the heretics will be throwing all the demons they can at us. Can you get us at least a few mobile pylons to play with?" I looked at the drone. Multiple units are under construction and will be ready for deployment within 18 standard hours. We'll need to protect them. "We will. How do recent developments change our strategy?" I inquired. "The plans to assault the Deimos Peninsula would require some tweaks to incorporate the Eldar's help and account for the possibility of a massive demon incursion in the Ares Badlands." Part 8. Mariah Bay, Kronus. The ambushes in the jungle were wildly successful. Brother Sergeant Went and his Blood Raven unit struck, again and again, always fading away. They kept breaking contact before the traitors could organize an overwhelming force at the point of contact. Light artillery and mines served well to break or at least slow down enemy force concentrations that might otherwise be proven problematic to handle. By the time enough assorted traitors and heretic gathered to push the Astartes away from the jungle, the Guard had set up forward defensive positions at the approaches to the Ares Badlands. What should have been a decisive attack from the Chaos forces met dug in infantry regiments, artillery, and an armored spearhead waiting for an opportunity to counterattack. The remnants of the traitor regiment shattered upon the defenses and massed artillery scattered their reinforcements. Brother Sergeant Wen and his Astartes received a few hours to rest, patch up their gear and resupply, Then it was back to the jungle for them. This time, there were no ambushes, but a widespread net of soldiers and servo skulls meant to purge the region from enemy surprises and secure it as a logistics route for future operations. Nothing was surprising there. While not precisely routine, Adeptus Astartes had been providing force multipliers for similar exercises for a long time, while waiting for a mission that would properly warrant their specialized skills. In this particular case, Went's unit received new orders while they were in the middle of harassing a group of heavily armed mutants who were on the run. Targets in the open, the sergeant reported. Squishies, coordinates. The mutants reached a nearby clearing just as ordnance whistled through the air and detonated above their heads. Blessed promethium and red-hot shrapnel lanced down, slicing through thick fur, scales, and harder-to-identify surfaces before bathing everything in cleansing flames. Headhunter 1-1, Aquila 2. We have a new tasking for you. Our allies. The female voice of the Vox operator briefly faltered at using the term for a Xeno. Located ancient facility traitor forces were attempting to breach. You're to proceed to the target with haste and secure it for Mechanicus and Inquisitorial examination. Transports are en route. You'll link with the Necron recon element at the following coordinates. Aquila 2, Headhunter 1-1, confirm tasking. Secure facility and do not engage Necron forces in the AO unless fired upon. When asked, just to make sure. Frankly, as of late, events on Kronus had a bizarre turn of events, and something was telling him the world wouldn't start making sense again anytime soon. Assyria forests, Kronus. 3 hours later, and 2 rundown groups of traitors later, Wen's band of brothers arrived at their destination. Ancient, thick forests covered the whole region, cut by a relatively small number of roads near the coast. To the north, he could barely see the mountain peaks where the Necron's primary stronghold on the planet hid. In the south, steep hills and walls created a killing ground that cut through the primary road leading to the Deimos Peninsula. The Astartes' destination was to the northwest, hidden by thick trees. Some of them were beyond ancient, towering as silent guardians from the time of the Horus heresy. The area was anything but secure. Surviving enemy forces running from the Moriah Bay flooded it from the east, while small bands and traitor engineering parties swarmed from the south, determined to turn the region into a death trap. Necron light forces and drone swarms rampaged throughout the forest, turning them into one giant battlefield. Case in point, a few hundred black forms buzzed above the Rhino and Chimera transport, carrying the Astartes and their guard auxiliaries. Less than a minute later, the forest to the left went up in flame, and angry screeching revealed the presence of an unlucky heretic band. Cracks of lightning heralded the insertion of heavier Necron forces, and soon the skirmish ended. About 100 drones came back and flew above the small convoy in escort formation. The proximity of the Xeno units made Went's arms itch to grab his weapon and shoot them until there wasn't a single one left. He was sure his brothers felt the same, and the regular humans with them had to be feeling much worse. It was a relief when they reached a small clearing showing the sign of battle. Shattered trees burned off the grass, pieces of traitor Astartes, including a crushed helmet sitting on its side in the middle of the glade. This had to be the traitor unit that attempted to breach the facility. Disembark and stay frosty, check your fire and try not to shoot at our allies. Went ordered despite what his decades of experience told him. The Xeno was the enemy as much as traitors and heretics. But not today. Or tomorrow. The Astartes quickly spread out, using what little cover they could find, while the guardsmen were still busily disembarking. The area is secure, one of the Necron drones declared. A heavy infantry squad is holding the entrance of the facility. It bobbed in the air and headed for the far end of the glade. Follow. Emperor damned tin can. Are the auspexes clear? We're barely detecting those things, a guardsman grumbled and pointed at the drones milling above them. No sign of combat effective enemy units, a tech priest declared in a synthetic voice. Soon 2 red-robed figures got out of a chimera. Their mechadendrites flailed around, pointing equipment and weapons in all directions. Streams of excited binary followed, and Sergeant Wen knew that his mission just became that much more complicated. Victory Bay, Kronus. Late in the evening, I was back at the maintenance facility, where the cogboys and girls were supposed to be fixing up my gear. Recent events and the need to examine everything for nasty surprises pushed back the schedule a bit. On the bright side, there were now a lot more toys to play with lying around, even though many of them needed repair and endless rites to reconsecrate them in the name of the Omnissiah. I wasn't complaining. The purge I authorized Scipio to carry out netted me a lightly used Rosarius defensive field. Further, a few happy cogboys were busy refurbishing and upgrading a set of carapace armor for me. If their excited beeping was anything to go by, I might be the best protected regular human in the army on Kronus, when they finished my armor. At any rate, I didn't intend to charge headfirst into the fire this time around. Instead, the new plan required me to ride with the forces escorting the Necron pylons and making sure that the blank Munchkin would be safe and sound when the time to deal with demons came. The girl sat on the edge of a nearby workbench and curiously looked at the Martians working around us. She was munching on dried fruit, courtesy of Weber, who in turn was busy handling discipline issues. Several heavy armored and armed Ogrins milled nearby. They were now parts of my retinue, in no small part because they didn't trust anyone else. And things were looking up, which meant I might just live long enough to get shot by our reinforcements. That was a joyful development. Really. "What about Alexandria or Alex?" I asked the kid who still refused to utter a single word if she could speak in the first place. Now that I finally found myself with a bit of spare time, I decided that among other things, the kid finally needed a name. She scrunched her nose and kept munching on a piece of fruit. "Perhaps Celine. Or Selena, whatever you prefer. It means silent in an old dialect. It fits you." I tried again in exasperation. "We've been at this for the last half hour." At least it was enough of distraction to keep everyone on their toes while the tech priests measured the kid for her bean-sized armor. She turned her head to look at me and smiled, showing 2 rows of teeth covered in chunks of fruit. "Celine it is then, or is it Selena?" The girl raised a single finger, then returned her attention to the fruit. Her eyes followed the light show provided by the working Martians, and she proceeded to ignore me. "Celine, it suits you." I nodded, and now I had to get some paperwork filled up on her behalf. "Selene," one of the Ogrins repeated slowly and grinned. "I like it." "Then you're going to be keeping her safe. No good deed goes unpunished in the Emperor's Guard." "I should know." "We will." The other Ogrin nodded happily. Predictably, the brief period of peace and quiet suddenly ended. "Lord Inquisitor, our advance forces found something you should know about." A young tech priest ran into the room. He was mostly human, with almost no visible bionics or cybernetics. "There's a still operational Zeus-class relay and control station at the Assyria forests. Magos Explorator Gowis reports that we should have full control of the facilities soon." All the Martians halted whatever they were doing. They turned around to look at the kid who flushed under the attention. "That's great, right?" The rapid streams of binary that followed pointed at this probably being something major or the cogboys being themselves. Then the kid said something that got my undivided attention, even though the binary chants mostly swallowed them. "Say again," I demanded aloud. "At least 5 still active orbital bombardment platforms," the young cogboy blurted out. "Magos Explorator Gaius believes he will have the machine spirits placated soon, and we should have control of the orbital weapons then." Well, I didn't see this one coming. However, I could see why everyone was so happy, even though my newfound joy was likely for a different reason. If even one of those platforms was still armed and operational, it would make our lives much easier. Chapter 10, Parts 9 and 10. Chapter 10. Tonight we dine in hell. Part 9. Assyria forests. Kronus. It should have taken them days, no weeks, to properly perform all the necessary rituals. Awakening such ancient, holy machine spirits, blessed by the Omnissiah himself, was a slow, careful, and precise work. Magos Explorator. Gaius should have had the time to examine the beyond ancient corridors at his leisure and bask at the everlasting achievements of the ancients before even thinking about touching the holy machinery. Instead, in a few hours, the Necrons had the whole facility opened up, mapped, and their drones were busy repairing everything in a crude mockery of the Omnissiah's sacred rituals. It was working. The Astartes guarding Gaius and his acolyte were even happy at the insanely dangerous and improperly fast progress. The Magos Explorator himself was torn. The unfolding events had all the hallmarks of sacrilege, and he was one of the more progressive members of the Mechanicus. He didn't even want to think about the reaction of his more conservative peers, who were now too busy dead after Scipio Row 11 and his cohorts purged them with inquisitorial backing. The old Magos knew that sooner or later there would be hell to pay, and to avoid the worst of the fallout, he needed a result. This facility was a good start. The Necron-supplied technology, if approved, would help as well. However, they weren't the reason why Gaius was on Kronus. His allies back home wanted the legacy of Magos Palladius, and all leads they could discover led to this forgotten world. Due to Xeno and heretical interference, Gaius was unable to find anything tangible. Just rumors and the barest traces of Palladius' presence in the distant past. This facility didn't answer any pressing questions, merely raised new ones. For example, the place had been sealed for 10,000 years. There was no trace it had been breached or opened for that matter until now. Yet there were clear traces of combat inside, including the remnants of the tech priests and guards manning it. How heresy found its place inside, Gaius had no idea, and that naturally made him wary. The Necrons didn't help. Their machines jump-started the logic engine responsible for the facility's critical operations, even gained limited access to its functions. It was fast, brutal yet elegant in a way Gaius knew he wouldn't be able to replicate without some of the most sacred and coveted relics held within vaults on critically important Forge worlds. The Necrons did it with what was for all intents and purposes light, disposable, multi-purposes machines. Not even a sacred fusion of flesh and metal, just machines. It was vexing, infuriating, yet it stirred burning envy too. Beyond ancient large screens and hololiths came to life painfully slowly, yet when they did, the images were crisp and clear. Better than most the Mechanicus could easily produce these days. The image of Kronus appeared above the main hololith in the control center, then blinked rapidly while powerful scanners sang their songs and tagged everything in orbit. The logic engine quickly recognized the Imperial designs, even though it painted them in amber due to not having their IFFs in its databanks. Multiple red symbols appeared next, showing the small battered Tau fleet keeping station above the blue Xenos' holdings. A sorry collection of mostly disabled orc monstrosities came next, barely holding orbit above the Greenskin stronghold, thus preventing its purge by the Imperial Navy. And finally, a handful of traitor vessels hung above the Deimos Peninsula. Those combined with the warp emanations coming from the abominable gate there made effective orbital bombardment impossible. Another pulse rippled through the crystal-clear hologram, and 5 new grey symbols flickered to life. Their designations were in an older dialect of Gothic, though one Gaius could easily read. Orbital Bombardment Platforms, Ares class. The Magos loudly praised the Omnissiah and ran to a nearby console, his revere interrupted by the new information. He demanded data on those platforms, only to find out he needed access codes he lacked. He had to placate the machine spirit of the logic engine and gain more access. Who knew what other treasures this facility might allow him to find? Task Force Talon, Thurabis Plateau, Kronus. It was close to midnight and low clouds covered the sky. It should have been pitch black out here in the heart of the desert. Instead, a green glow and the occasional arcing lighting illuminated the white sands, instead of forgotten ancient ruins that should have been buried and unrecognizable at this point. Dark metal monoliths rose into the sky. We could see neat squares of cylindrical generators, heavy weapon emplacements guarding them. There were even a handful of immense forms poking from the sands and pointing at the overcast sky. There was no mistaking those ground-to-orbit installations. The Necrons took the security of their base seriously, a fact underscored by the escort we picked up as soon as we approached the territory they claimed. Fusions of Necron warriors and skimmers silently floated around our task force by the dozens. More joined them with every kilometer we advanced. Soon we could no longer see the sky due to an immense swarm of drones buzzing overhead. Some were familiar, others resembled tiny insects, no larger than a grown man's fist. Inquisitor, I'm glad they're on our side. Commissar Weber sat beside me on top of a chimera. My Kassakin bodyguards rode in the troop compartment below. My new Ogrin friends travelled into the following vehicles. They refused to let me get too far away from them. The newly named Selene rode on top as well and dozed off, cuddled in my side, to the profound relief of my security detail. I hope our superiors will agree when they arrive. A pair of Titan-sized monoliths joined the procession, escorting a number of floating pylons. The Necrons had altered the precious devices. They were attached to oversized skimmers similar to the lower bodies of the destroyers, and other half-metal men, half-machines that surrounded us. An utterly silent flash of blinding lightning struck, and we weren't alone on the Chimera's roof. The Necron Lord himself towered above us in all his glory. He was even larger than before, all pristine dark silver necrodermis with green undertones. His eyes blazed with power when he looked down at us. "We're ready," he rasped in a deep, halting way. "We're ready too." I carefully waved at the armored column stretching behind us. It contained the fastest vehicles the Guard had available and nearly half of the Blood Raven's armored forces. "Proceed," the Necron Lord ordered, and a shudder went through the Xeno forces surrounding us. Then they moved forward as one. "With this, we might stand a chance when assaulting Hell today," Weber muttered, then winced when he remembered where he was and who could overhear him. "We're going to Hell and back, my friend. Tonight we dine in Hell and kill every single traitor, heretic, or demon who dares stand in our way." The Necron Lord looked at us with what might have been exasperation. All available data points out that consuming food in Hell would be hazardous for your health. He was joking, right? Part 10. The Green Coast. Kronus. Gorguts managed to drag himself to his stronghold. Doing so was an exercise of pain and futility with no foe to fight. At least the slog gave him ample time to think. There was war in the air. He could smell it, feel it in his itching bones, and that wasn't just broken and cracks mending. He burned with the desire to go out there and fight, to become bigger and stronger. It would be a great wah! Gorguts grinned at the thought, grabbed an unlucky squig that wasn't fast enough in getting away, and bit off its head. His teeth crunched bone and cartilage with ease. The snack helped the warboss center himself. By Gork and Mork, he knew something odd was happening to him. He was thinking, something unusual even for a warboss of his statute. And his thoughts, they weren't all proper Okri-like. He should have been in the grips of great rage right now. His great stronghold, the pride of all orcs in this sector, which was proper Orky-like, was all but empty. There weren't enough boys left for a proper wah, much less a real wah. Instead of smashing skulls, squishing Gretchen, and terrorizing any weird or mechbios that were still alive, he simply stood in the heart of his fortress, munched on a snack, and thought. Gorguts didn't have enough boys left for a proper war. That very thought made him itch and shake in frustration, and even if he had the boys, he didn't have enough big guns, not enough Daka. He finished the snack and looked for another squig, while one of the handful's surviving mech boys tried his best to hammer his armor in shape. Gorguts looked down at the much smaller boy, at the scrap hammer he was using, and at the armor he wore with pride. It was proper Orky. It was nice red. It was also little more than scrap. Likewise, it was really pathetic, Gorguts thought, and sighed in frustration. When he closed his eyes, he could almost see orcs who weren't orcs, warbosses, and boys of size he couldn't have imagined before. He could see their weapons and armor. They were Orky, yet not. They were whole, massive, beautiful. They weren't made of scrap. That was a beautiful future. One of a wah, the kind of even Gorguts could scarcely imagine. Yet the orcs he could imagine, the ones who could bring it into being, they were different. They were smarter, both less and more Orky, if that made sense. See, he had too much time to think. That wasn't proper Orky, yet he couldn't stop. Gorguts wanted to get all the boys and go charge the enemy, the Humiers, the smelly Humiers, the Bly boys, even those metal boys. Instead, the warboss looked at the sky. To the south, he could see purple, sick clouds and ugly lighting. To the north, dark, rainy clouds. Yet right above his stronghold, the sky was clear, full of stars, of worlds to conquer. He wanted to spread the joys of the Wa-I-Yi to every single one of them. His blood bubbled with excitement at the possibilities, at the conflicts yet to come. Gorgut stared at the sky and remembered his Wa dying under an awesome amount of proper Daka. He knew there were a few cruisers up there, all shot up and nearly useless. All they could do was perhaps prevent the same from happening to his stronghold. That simply wouldn't do. It was painful to admit it, however, the Wa on Kronus, at least the proper Orky one, was over. It would take time for enough boys to spawn, even longer to get a sufficient number of mech boys to build Daka and vehicles, to get weird boys, so they could make the fun even better. Gorguts looked around wistfully. There was just a single knob left, and he was on the smaller side, even smaller now because the boy was busy regrowing an arm and half his face. The poor bastard had almost no teeth left, just a single half-broken tusk. At least he got a nice heavy chopper held in his remaining hand. It merrily sparkled with proper Orky energy, and it was ready to bash skulls. "You!" Gorguts pointed at the knob. "Go, gather all the boys. I'll speak to them," he declared. Already wisps of a plan were forming within his itching brain. Gorguts would leave this rock, take all his boys and go forth, find a place to prepare a proper Wah! This time it won't burn from the sky. When he was ready, when he gathers enough boys, nothing would stop him. But first he should make a gift for the Humies and everyone else who opened his eyes to the truth. It wouldn't be proper Orky otherwise. Acaria Forests, Kronus. Brother Sergeant Went escorted Magos Scipio Row 11 into the ancient facility. The senior surviving Mechanicus representative on Kronus would be the one to do the honors and begin the battle to eradicate the traitors from the face of the planet. They passed by groups of heavily armed servitors, guardsmen setting up defensive positions, and the odd impassive Necron protecting the facility. Those were the same Xenos who tore the traitors outside to pieces. 4 serpentine wraiths lurked in dark corners. One of them was quite obvious. For more than a day now, it toyed with the crushed helmet of traitor Astartes. 2 standard Necron warriors stood still like statues at the entrance of the facility. Another pair guarded the command center. Those 2 were a bit different. Their forms were built lighter compared to most of their kind, Went had the displeasure to see. They carried shorter versions of their Gauss weapons, and each had a sword of dark, almost pitch-black metal clamped to their backs. They were among the most animated Necrons the sergeant had ever seen. Instead of acting like statues, their heads turned to follow everyone in view, and if he didn't know better, the Astartes would swear they were curious. "The convoy will enter extreme weapons range of the enemy soon." The Necron to the right spoke, surprising everyone. "I'm aware," Magos Scipio Row 11 stated without breaking stride. "That's why I'm here. Our assault will begin momentarily." He passed through the checkpoint and sent a stream of binary at the tech priests working inside. One of them, Gaius, the senior one, answered with an angry whistle. "Needs must," Scipio Row 11 continued in a normal voice. "We don't have any more time. We'll be apologizing and placating the machine spirits later. Now they'll have to serve the Omnissiah." The Magos made his way to the primary hololith and interfaced with the console in front of it. The hologram showing Kronus and the forces in orbit zoomed in. 2 red, 1 amber and 2 yellow symbols slowly converged above the continent, the weapon platforms. Suddenly, the 2 critically damaged ones shifted orbits and rapidly accelerated. The hologram rippled and descent vectors appeared, leading straight at the heavy defenses that made an approach towards the Deimos Peninsula from this region suicidal. The other 3 platforms moved more slowly, merely shifting their orbits, so they would be in a position very soon. Active scans went out from the damaged Tau battle group, though the Xenoships didn't react otherwise. The Orc scrap heaps did nothing. They probably failed to detect the activity in orbit. The hologram zoomed in until it showed an orbital view of the Deimos Peninsula. Warp emanations and corrupted clouds covered almost the whole region, making precise targeting unreliable. It was another question if any bombardment passing through those clouds would even hit the ground. The outer defense lines set up by the traitors had no such defenses, and they were more than formidable enough to warrant the attention of the Ares platforms. The two units without active weaponry went down first, like the fiery fists of furious saint-smiting infidels. And this was one of the few instances when such thoughts would be proper for a space marine, went thought. Traitor Astartes, demon engines, corrupted vehicles. Traitorous PDF forces, mutants, cultists, and barely controlled Reaver war bands, they all looked at the heavens and their judgment. They saw the falling platforms, and those at the target areas tried to run, while others stubbornly stood their ground. It didn't matter. Macro cannons, lance batteries, and fusion missiles tore their way through the heavens, lighting them in purifying fire. Task Force Retribution's surviving artillery park opened up at the same moment. The traitor, the heretic, the unclean, and demon-infested machinery, they all burned, and this was only the beginning. Interceptors and anti-air weaponry rose in defiance only to be largely ignored. Explosives and Gauss weaponry leveled huge swaths of forest to open the way for armored spearheads. The guard advanced like a mailed fist, flanked by Necron destroyers and 100 Eldar Grav tanks racing to exploit the enemy confusion. Walkers and mechanized infantry followed behind them, while elite units waited in reserve. Sergeant Went smiled. This was merely a taste of things to come. The traitors would rue the day they turned on the Imperium of Man.